Happy Mother's Day. Yeah. And if you are a lady and you see there's some flowers over there, make sure you get a flower or two on your way out. And any guys that forgot to get their wives flowers like me, you're off the hook. I think. I hope. So, hey, next week we are going to begin a new series called I Believe. Yeah, Larry's going to start off that series in which we go through some of the foundational truths that we believe, taking from the Nicene Creed, a historic creed that has been around since about the year 325. So we still believe those things, and we're going to go through those line by line through the weeks, and so hopefully it'll be a blessing to you. But today we're going to be looking at a woman who desperately wanted to be a mother, but almost wasn't until God intervened. And we're not looking at her because it's Mother. Well, we are looking at her because it's Mother's Day, but we're not looking at her to honor her so much as it is to learn from her and for her to be an inspiration, not just to mothers, not even just to women in general, but to all of us who seek to live a godly life and to be dedicated to God. And if you haven't figured it out yet, we're going to be looking at Hannah, whose life is talked about in the book of 1 Samuel. In fact, Hannah was Samuel's mom. Samuel's father was a man by the name of Elkanah. And although Elkanah loved Hannah, Hannah was barren, couldn't have children. In fact, some Bible scholars actually believe that because Hannah couldn't have children, that may have been the reason that Elkanah took a second wife, a woman by the name of Peninnah. You know, in that time, in that culture, for a woman to not be able to have children was really a great humiliation, a great shame in that, because children were viewed as being a blessing from God. And so to not be able to have children was almost seen as God withholding a blessing. God withholding a blessing. Even in 1 Samuel chapter 1 there in verse 5, we read, it says, the Lord had closed her womb. The Lord had closed Hannah's womb. And so, you know, that happens from God. And yet Hannah is a godly woman. She is a godly woman. So even before we get into the life of Hannah and looking at her, I want to start off, and what we're going to be doing here is looking in what I call faith lessons. And even before we start reading much into her life, I want to start off with this first faith lesson, and that's the idea that God withholding a blessing is not proof of His displeasure with us. Okay? Just because God withholds a blessing, that's not proof that He's somehow displeased with us. That God can choose to bless us with things that we want, or He can withhold those blessings. Neither one is proof of how God feels about us. I mean, if it was, then we would have to assume that God was more pleased with Peninnah than He was with Hannah. I mean, if blessings that we get from God are an indication of how He feels about us, but the Bible doesn't tell us how He did feel about Peninnah. It doesn't tell us, you know, that He was more pleased with her. In fact, there's kind of an indication that she wasn't as what we might call godly, didn't exhibit some of the godly characteristics that we read about from Hannah. Like I said, God doesn't tell us how He felt, but it does portray her as less than godly, because Peninnah tried to add to Hannah's misery. It's bad enough that she's not able to have children, this blessing from God, and maybe feel shame in that, but Peninnah tries to rub it in, tries to make her feel even worse about it. Maybe, I don't know, maybe she felt justified in doing that because after all, if this is somehow God's judgment, if that's the way people viewed it, then maybe she felt justified in jumping on board and kind of punishing Hannah the way she thought God was doing there. In any case, we start reading in 1 Samuel 1, starting in verse 6, it says, "Because the Lord had closed Hannah's womb, her rival kept provoking her in order to irritate her. This went on year after year. Whenever Hannah went up to the house of the Lord, her rival provoked her, till she wept and would not eat. Her husband Elkanah would say to her, 'Hannah, why are you weeping? Why don't you eat? Why are you downhearted? Don't I mean more to you than 10 sons?' Well, as much as her husband Elkanah loved her, tried to console her, nothing seemed to bring Hannah peace. And yet what's interesting is that she continued to go to the house of the Lord. Right? Even she continued to worship God year after year with Elkanah and even with Peninnah, who's trying to irritate her the whole time and provoke her. And so Hannah's faith is not contingent on God blessing her. Hannah's faith is not conditioned on her getting what she wanted. There's no indication that Hannah thought that she would disown God, if you will. There was no indication that she thought about turning away from God because she didn't get what she wanted or maybe desired. And so the second faith lesson that I get from the life of Hannah is that she continued to pursue a relationship with God, or she would say, continue to pursue a relationship despite your disappointment when he doesn't give you what you want. But on one of those times that they go to the temple, her situation was about to change. She was going to have circumstances are going to change. After they had finished eating and drinking, she goes up again to the temple there, the tabernacle, if you will, to what she says, pour out her heart to the Lord. And so starting in verse 10, we read that in her deep anguish, Hannah prayed to the Lord, weeping bitterly. And she made a vow, saying, "Lord Almighty, if you will only look on your servant's misery and remember me, and not forget about your servant, but give her a son, then I will give him to the Lord for all the days of his life, and no razor will ever be used on his head." I have a book in my library written by a guy named Philip Yancey, and it's called Prayer. Does it make any difference? Prayer, does it make any difference? And one of the lines in his book, Philip Yancey says, "Sometimes I wonder if the words I use are the least important part of prayer. Prayer invites me to lower my defenses and present the self that no other person fully knows to a God who already knows." And in his book, he also quotes from C.S. Lewis. And he has this quote from Lewis who says, "The prayer preceding all prayers is, may it be the real I who speaks. May it be the real thou that I speak to." And so what we see in Hannah is not only the idea that she continued to pursue a relationship with God because he's the real God, but she presents the real self, her real self, with all her longings and her struggles and her pain and disappointment, even with the one who had closed her womb. And so the third faith lesson I want to draw from Hannah's life is find a place where you can pour out your heart to God. Find a place where you can pour out your heart to God. The idea of confession is not so much that we tell everyone, our deep, dark secrets. Confession is about being honest with God. That's what Jesus talked about even on the Sermon on the Mount. Remember what he talked about? He says, when you pray, go into your room, and close the door and pray to your Father who is unseen. And then your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you. But part of the reward is in finding that place where we can let down and just be who we are, is the idea that we can have a relationship that we can just let down our defenses there, be accepted for who we truly are. I wonder if that's part of the reward that Jesus had in mind. But in any sense, Hannah goes into the tabernacle there, into the presence of God, where she can pour out her heart, where she can let down her defenses and just pour out the anguish in her heart. And she thought she was alone. She didn't realize that the high priest Eli was actually in the corner there observing. At that time, a lot of times prayers were usually said out loud. People would pray aloud. And so when Eli sees her and her lips are moving, but there's no words coming out, he accuses her actually of being drunk. That happened times during these times of festivals. Whenever they would make that pilgrimage to the tabernacle, it would be times of eating and drinking. And it so happened there were times probably that people would ate too much and drank too much. And so he actually accuses her of being drunk at one of these festivals there that they're at. And verse 15, she says, "Not so, my lord," Hannah replied. "I'm a woman who is deeply troubled. I've not been drinking wine or beer. I was pouring out my heart, my soul to the Lord. Do not take your servant for a wicked woman. I have been praying here out of my great anguish and grief." Eli answered her, "Go in peace, and may the God of Israel grant you what you have asked him." She said, "May your servant find favor in your eyes." And then she went on her way and ate something, and her face was no longer downcast. Well, it's saying Hannah seems to take it that what Eli has just pronounced is actually going to come true. She seems to have taken it that this is actually going to happen, that in fact God is going to act according to what Eli the high priest has just told her, because she goes out from there no longer downcast. Now you might call that naive. But she sees Eli as someone who's speaking on behalf of God, that he speaks for God. And so part of me really longs for that kind of faith. Not in the sense that I just believe what somebody else says, but to believe in what God says. And so kind of the fourth lesson from the life of Hannah is to truly believe what God says. Truly believe what God says. Now, what does that mean, though, to truly believe? I mean, we usually think of belief as something that happens kind of up here, right? We believe in our head. But to a Jewish person, and that's not how a Jewish person understood belief. They would say that I only truly believe because I changed the way I live. The book of Hebrews has a whole chapter 11, a whole chapter about people in the Old Testament whose faith caused them to live differently than other people around them. For instance, in chapter Hebrews 11:1, now faith is confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see. He says this is what the ancients were commended for, that their faith enabled them to live different, to live with confidence, to live with assurance. To a Jewish person, faith had to be lived out. They would say if you didn't live it out, well, maybe that's an indication that you really didn't believe. Now, Hebrews chapter 11, it doesn't mention Hannah, but it certainly could have, because she leaves Eli with this confidence and assurance that the Hebrews writer talks about. Confidence and assurance about that it's going to happen. And Hebrews 11 goes on in verse 6 to say, without faith it's impossible to please God, because anyone who comes to him must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who earnestly seek him. Now, obviously, that ultimate reward is our heavenly home. That's the ultimate reward, but God's also the God who rewards time here and now. Just like Abraham. The Hebrew writers does bring up Abraham as kind of the epitome of faith, the person who epitomized what it means to walk in faith with God. And so because of Abraham was this person of faith, he was enabled to become a father, despite, even as the Hebrew writer says, he was as good as dead. The Hebrews writer, he's as good as dead, but he was enabled to be faith. And in the same way, so life is going to come to Hannah's barren womb. And so as she leaves the tabernacle and leaves Eli, she returns home and in fact becomes pregnant and gives birth to Samuel. Gives birth to Samuel. She named him Samuel because she said, I asked God for him. Inherent within the name of Samuel is this word for asking. Contained in his word is this word asked. But Hannah not only asked the Lord, she made a vow too, didn't she? She not only asked God, she made a vow. If Lord would give her a son, Lord, give me a son, and she'd give her son to the Lord. Not figuratively, literally. Psalm 15 says, Lord, who may dwell on your sacred tent? Who may live on your holy mountain? And then it answers, the one whose walk is blameless, who does what is righteous. And it begins to list some of the characteristics of righteous people. And one of the characteristics says, he who keeps an oath even when it hurts and does not change his mind. Don't you know that Hannah shed quite a few tears the day that she had to take little Samuel to the tabernacle and leave him with the old priest Eli? In fact, the previous year, she didn't even go to the tabernacle that year. In verse 21 to 22, it says, when her husband Elkanah went up with all his family to offer the annual sacrifice to the Lord and to fulfill his vow, Hannah did not go. She said to her husband, after the boy is weaned, I will take him and present him before the Lord, and he will live there always. It doesn't say why she didn't go, but you know why. I suspect it was just too painful to go that year. I think it was just too painful to go that year, realizing that the next year she was going to go and leave her son Samuel. The fact that he says after he was weaned means that she's going to leave him when he's a toddler. After she's nursed him and loved him, and she's about ready to leave her son. It must have torn her up inside, to be torn away from the child she wanted more than anything. But as much as Hannah loved Samuel, she loved God even more. And so the fifth lesson that I draw from Hannah's life is if Hannah's faith wasn't just about how God could bless her, it was also how he could use her for his purposes, even if it hurt. Even if it hurt. Giving up a child, as Hannah did, is what our Heavenly Father did. Only she gave her son to minister at the tabernacle, and our Father gave his son to die on the cross. Hannah gave her son to minister at the tabernacle where sacrifices would be brought. God had his son be the sacrifice there in the heavenly temple. And every week we remember that great sacrifice in the Lord's Supper. And we're going to do that now. If you haven't already partaken or gotten the elements, I invite you to go to the table and we will get those communion elements. As you have those there in your hand or sitting there in front of you, I'd like to read some passages from the book of Hebrews that kind of get our minds oriented to the great sacrifice that we have and what we have in Jesus. Hebrews, the writer of Hebrews says, during the days of Jesus' life on earth, he offered up prayers and petitions with loud cries and tears to the one who could save him from death. And he was heard because of his reverent submission. Although he was a son, he learned obedience from what he suffered. And once made perfect, he became the source of eternal salvation for all who obey him, and was designated by God to be high priest in the order of Melchizedek. When Christ came as high priest of the good things that are already here, he went through the greater and more perfect tabernacle that is not man-made, that is to say, not a part of this creation. He did not enter by means of the blood of goats and calves, but he entered the most holy place once and for all by his own blood, having obtained eternal redemption. The blood of goats and bulls and the ashes of a heifer sprinkled on those who are ceremonially unclean sanctify them so that they are outwardly clean. How much more then will the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself unblemished to God, cleanse our consciences from acts that lead to death, so that we may serve the living God. For this reason, Christ is the mediator of a new covenant, that those who are called may receive the promised eternal inheritance, now that he has died as a ransom to set them free from the sins committed under the first covenant. Therefore, brothers and sisters, since we have confidence to enter the most holy place by the blood of Jesus, by a new and living way opened for us through the curtain that is his body, and since we have a great high priest over the house of God, let us draw near to God with a sincere heart and full assurance of faith, having our hearts sprinkled to cleanse us from a guilty conscience, and having our bodies washed with pure water. Let us hold unswervingly to the hope we profess, for he who promised is faithful. And let us consider how we may spur one another on toward love and good deeds. And let us not give up meeting together as some are in their habit of doing, but let us encourage one another, and all the more as you see the day approaching. The night before he died, Jesus took bread, and he gave it to his disciples, and he said, "This is my body given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." And he took the cup and gave thanks and said, "Drink from it. This is the blood of my covenant, the covenant of my blood, shed for the forgiveness of sins. Do this in remembrance." We're going to go ahead and move into our table groups at this time.